I'm going to introduce Dawn to you now, so I'm hoping that IT will bring up her presentation in a moment. Dawn and I go back a little way as well, actually. We've known each other quite a while. We've sort of drifted in and out of each other's lives a little bit. I suggested Dawn as a speaker today because I know about the work she has been doing and continues to do with victims. We particularly connect over a very difficult case, which I won't talk about, but she has been outstanding in her determination for justice for a particular family. Incredibly determined when some people would have given up a very long time ago, and understandably. She is also, I'm delighted to say, Director of Safeguarding at Stonyhurst College. If you know Stonyhurst, you'll know that it's in the British province of the Society of Jesus. Stonyhurst is regarded as the gold standard. It's a beautiful school. Go and visit it, if only to see the school, and you might also get a chance to talk to Dawn. It's in England, obviously, but prior to that, so this is a new post. I don't know any other school that has appointed a director of safeguarding. Schools in the United Kingdom will have designated safeguarding leads, because we have to, amongst the teaching staff, but a director of safeguarding was a really innovative post, and I was delighted that she was a candidate, because I was on the interview panel. Anyway, there's no favoritism. Prior to that, she worked in Salford Diocese in England, supporting the work of the diocese and the religious congregations in safeguarding. She does come with this incredible wealth of experience. She has also been working with 2 survivor charities and established Healing the Community, an independent service run by professionals and with the lived experience of experts as well. So I'm sure you will have much to gain from Dawn's presentation this afternoon, but very welcome to come and talk to us. Thank you.
So can I just start with, whoever builds these podiums, build them for men. 4'10", it's not good. So, thank you for inviting me, Tina, and it's a real pleasure to be here to speak to you today on this really important topic. When I was thinking about what I should talk to you all today, I went back to the old adage, talk about what you know. So I thought this will be a really short presentation. And I'm not being entirely flippant here. This is a complex topic, as I'm sure you all know, and can mean so many things to different people, to those of us ministering or working in the church, and to those experiencing the church as survivors. In my experience, nothing about accountability is simple. At times when I have felt that we, the church, as an organisation, or myself as a professional, were coming up short when supporting survivors, I would propose solutions. I am very solution-focused. Unfortunately for me, most of my solutions ended up with more questions. This did not sit naturally with me or comfortably. As a natural rescuer, I am someone who does not sit comfortably with uncertainty and not knowing how to make things better. But through the work of survivors and with the support of survivors, I have learned that this has taught me to grow both personally and professionally from wrestling with the questions, and I hope that that sentiment sits with some of you here today. The question I think I've been asked the most about by religious leaders is, what can I do to make this right for this person? I never doubt the positive intent in that question. Personally, I have never sat with a religious leader that doesn't want to get it right. But then the complexities can at times be overwhelming, leading to either inaction or, conversely but equally problematic, a hurried and clumsy response that leaves no one satisfied. I'm not expecting that this will be a universally shared experience of religious leaders, but thankfully it is mine. I can say, however, that I have worked with some who don't want to put the hard work in, required to getting it right. And I have worked with far too many members of our faith, members of the lay and members of clergy, who still do not feel that the church should be held to account for what they see as the past offences of a small minority. As Tina has said, I myself have heard comments such as, why should the church be held accountable for one rogue priest? Or survivors are only interested in money. These comments are shocking and would not be expected today in other organisations, but sadly they are still present for us here in the church. The second question I get asked is, what shall I call them? Thankfully, this one's much easier for me to answer. Bill, Terry, Karen, Jean. On speaking to many survivors, the question that for them is most important is that you see them as the whole person, not just a product of the abuse or the trauma that this has caused. They want, like many of us, to be treated with respect, to be seen and to be heard. That's not to say, however, that this isn't an important question, but like most things I'm going to touch on today, it's about entering the relationship with humility. If you don't know, ask. It's okay to respectfully ask a survivor, how would you like to be referred to? In person and also in my notes. That's good practice. It makes it clear to them notes will be kept. Record keeping is important. Another point that I'd like to make that may seem obvious but is worthy of reminding ourselves here today is that each survivor is unique, has different needs and experiences and wants. Each individual is motivated to share their account for very different reasons, some of which even they can't explain or articulate yet. But we must remember it's always a gift, a privilege, and if done well, can be an enriching shared journey. For me, accountability is about the way we show up for survivors, and I have had some truly profound experience of this. I've also had some opportunities for deep learning and reflection, and I will share some of those with you today. Sometimes I got things wrong, badly wrong. Please don't judge me on those experiences alone. It's over a 13-year career of working with survivors. One final comment I'd like to make is about the addition to the title of this presentation, and hope for the church, because I think that's an important part of the work that we do with survivors. Most people, when they casually ask me, what do you do for a living, have one of two responses to my reply that I'm a director of safeguarding for the Catholic Church. There is either an awkward pause and a quick desire to move the conversation on to something else, or there is a comment that says something along the lines of, oh, how depressing. They could not be more wrong. Challenging, yes. Frustrating, often. Exhausting, absolutely. But the most rewarding and energizing work I have ever done. If sitting with a survivor and hearing their account does not inspire you to get things done fairly, justly, and rightly, I don't know what will. Furthermore, surely their willingness to work with us is the clearest evidence yet that there is hope for the church, even on tackling this difficult issue. The word accountability means different things to each of us. I can't tell you how many times I've sat here, written, tweeted, reworded my presentation, because every time I spoke to someone about it, they had a different idea. However, I've settled on sharing my experiences as a practitioner of working with survivors, religious leaders and organisations, and also survivors groups in wrestling with this issue. For me, accountability is about the real transformative healing of harm for everyone involved: survivors, perpetrators, bystanders, families, friends, and our communities. I understand that right from the start, This may cause some controversy or discord amongst some of you in the room, with some questioning why perpetrators should be considered within this concept of transformative healing for survivors. But in my experience, many survivors have had complex relationships with those who have harmed them, including at one time prior to the abuse, sometimes a positive one. So for them, whilst they want the person to no longer be able to harm anyone else, they also have mixed feelings about what they want to happen next. Further to this, I would add that every survivor I have worked with has wanted more than punishment for their perpetrator. They have wanted their abuser to understand the impact of their behaviour and the harm caused. They have wanted them to change their behaviour so that they don't harm anyone else. And they have wanted them to apologise and make amends. For all of this to happen, therefore, in any meaningful way, I would suggest that the perpetrator needs to be a key consideration within this process. For every survivor I have worked with, though, they want more still. They want the organisation and its leaders to be accountable. And again, this can be controversial. They want the organisation to accept responsibility for the person who harmed them. They have questions about the discernment process, the lack of oversight and monitoring, and in some cases, the failure to respond swiftly and robustly when concerns were initially raised. We should see these opportunities for learning, but sometimes either our own ego or louder voices from solicitors or insurers or other advisors can stop us hearing the positive intent that is meant by survivors by raising these thorny questions. We can easily lose sight of why a survivor chooses to step forward and hide behind these advisors. It is the job of our leaders, however, to do just that, to lead morally and ethically on behalf of all of the church. That does not mean we can be blasé about our responsibilities in law, however. And so, yes, we have to consider the advice of others, but it is for our leaders, some of you here today, ultimately to make the best decision for the survivor and your organisation. In my experience, this is often the same solution. We are one church. What is good for survivors surely has to be good for the church. Survivors also want the church to be accountable for leaders' responses when they are made aware of abuse and harm that has been caused. They want to hear leaders take responsibility for their choices and the consequences of their choices. They expect us to do the hard work with our feelings, recognising that what those feelings are, sitting with those uncomfortable feelings, and unpeeling the how of and why this may be uncomfortable. Did we cause further harm? Did we sit outside our values? Did we sit outside the values of the church? Further to this, they want a commitment from us to make a plan so that we don't make the same choice moving forward, don't cause further harm to them or to others in our responses and our processes. So already we can see this is clearly complicated and can often take a long time for us to grapple with. But the other thing that survivors have told us very clearly is the process is too long and too protracted. So as I have previously mentioned, even on a basic level, the issue of accountability can throw up challenging different questions for us. How can I respond with the sense of urgency that a survivor might quite rightly expect, whilst at the same time having to understand a difficult, complex process, sitting with the discomfort of hearing their account, trying to work out which process, civil, criminal, or canonical I am following, and at the same time move positively and quickly within the organisation to make changes that are required. Accountability is also, in my view, about us being active, and survivors have said this. It is not a passive process. They don't want to be recipients in this. It is about all of us engaging in the process. And the key three actions that are repeated in my experience that survivors have asked for is that we apologise, we make amends, we change our behaviour so that it doesn't happen again. So in this context, accountability is about how we can make things right for that survivor. Not that we can go back and change things about what has happened from either ourselves or others, but in terms of what we can do now moving forward. It also involves us having the ability to look inwards and ask, what is the transformation that I need to make and my organisation needs to make in order to meet this survivor equally? For me personally, the work here involves being able to accompany someone, not being in a rush to fix things for them. To learn to just sit in that uncomfortableness and uncertainty and manage my own emotional response to this. My commitment to the work of accountability for survivors has always been fulsome, but at times I've risked reaching burnout. I have had to do the hard work on myself to connect without over-empathising, which could leave me at times feeling overwhelmed and hopeless and being of no service to that survivor. In order to do this, I needed to ensure that I had excellent supervision, and I would encourage all of you that are involved in this work to make sure that you also have professional supervision. I've become really good at prioritising and safeguarding the time for that work. However, the other piece of work that I needed to always work on for myself is about being boundaried with my time so that I could genuinely show up for a survivor. I have to say that's still a work in progress for me. These were just some of the ways in which I needed to work on my accountability to survivors. For working with religious leaders, if I'm honest, I found this to be a greater challenge at times. I had to reflect on their experience and manage my own frustrations at the decisions by committee attitude of the organisations. I failed to understand the importance of community in the context of religious life. I also at times failed to grasp the deep level of fear that some of them had in getting it wrong or making things worse. When asking survivors about what they felt, the things that were important for the church to address that demonstrated clear accountability, they said many things, as you can imagine, and as you have heard from the network groups from Tina. I've chosen to highlight just a few. They have said that we need to make reporting easy. Not easier, easy. Many individuals reported have taken years to come forward to share their accounts of abuse, having been unable to do so earlier for a variety of reasons, including, from my experience, one who had to wait for a parent to die because they wanted to protect that parent from having to feel the guilt for, in their words, failing to protect them as a child. Imagine that. Sit with that for a second. Think about having lost a loved one, grieving that loved one, and then choosing to come forward to talk about the abuse that happened to you all those years ago. Surely they deserve for reporting to be easy. Some survivors have challenging and chaotic lifestyles, including living with addictions, being unable to maintain a job, a relationship, a home. But they know that in order to move things forward, they need to talk about the abuse that happened to them all those years ago. Surely for that person, reporting needs to be easy. Or for one who had a serious psychiatric disorder that meant that they were in and out of hospital for large chunks of their time. As part of their treatment plan, they were encouraged to come forward and talk about the abuse that happened to them all those years ago. Surely that person deserves that we make a greater effort for reporting to be easy. I'm confident that all of you will agree on this, that this is one of the least controversial ways in which the church can be accountable. So why then is it still not the survivor's experience? Survivors report in the first place that there was no easy access to information about how to contact someone in the organisation, even in parts of the world where the church's national structures require organisations to do so. They have also told us that when they can access the information, it's too complicated, and that this felt like a purposeful barrier to stop them speaking out. When I was preparing for this presentation, I wanted to just check the validity of that statement before I included it in my presentation. So I had a quick look at the websites that were available just in England and Wales. It took me anywhere between 2 and 5 clicks to reach the contact information. And that's if I already know that the department I'm looking for is safeguarding. Only 2 sites specifically mentioned the word abuse, many choosing instead to use the word concern. Some sites only provided email contact details with no means of speaking to another human being. One diocese had no direct contact number and instead signposted survivors to a national survivor organisation. Another website had the review date for their safeguarding page as the 20th of April 2020. One site had a recent investigation report on the safeguarding page, but no contact details for anyone who may have been affected by having read that report. Others highlighted that the concerns would be reported to the police or signposted an individual directly to the police. And all of this I'm looking at while I'm scrolling past images of members of the clergy standing next to children. Reflect on that as a survivor's experience of trying to make contact with their church. So that's a long list, and I could spend the whole hour just talking about this, to be honest. But let's unpack some of the possible, if unintended, messages here for survivors. If I am anxious, distressed, nervous, angry, dysregulated, how likely am I to continue clicking and scrolling to find the details of someone to talk to? Survivors have advised that this makes them feel like the church is hiding, doesn't want to talk to them, hear their accounts, or be available for them. If English is not my first language, or I'm unfamiliar with the term safeguarding, how will I find the information that I'm looking for? Survivors have criticised the church for being obtuse and obfuscating, and of protecting the organisational reputation over the welfare of survivors. We need to learn to be comfortable with the language of abuse and the language of survivors. We need to be clear to help everyone to navigate the support available to them, because it is there. Each diocese and religious order in the UK has a contact person ready to be able to provide the information. So we should celebrate this, not hide it away. And that's not just for survivors, but for our children now. How do we protect them from abuse if we don't talk about these issues, if they don't know that it's right to speak up? Every survivor I have worked with has wanted a human response. So whilst for some survivors, being able to email in the first place may be helpful, for many, they want to test out the professionalism and commitment of the individual or the organisation that they will be required to place an incredible amount of trust in. Accountability to survivors is essentially about quality relationships. This is not achievable via email. Whilst as a professional, I understand the sentiment of signposting to a professional survivor agency. Survivors have expressed hurt that the organisation where the harm occurred did not want to engage with them. They felt a sense of once again being rejected and harmed by the church. They have said that it made them feel like an outsider, not wanted, other. And whilst for some they may have already felt like this because of the original abuse, the harm caused by this message from the church was deeply painful to many. They advised me that they were not interested in all the other things to do with safeguarding, and that all that they wanted was clear, simple information, but information with a choice as to how to contact the religious order or professional organisation, and that they felt that sometimes the excessive amount of information was a purposeful tactic. On the point of not reviewing information for safeguarding, They felt that this demonstrated a deep lack of care and attention about them, and that the organisation had simply done what it needed to do to pass the requirements of the national inquiry. And that now the inquiry was closed, it was back to business as usual, and demonstrated to them a lack of commitment to make amends and move things forward. Another significant concern for survivors was the deep sense of loss of control and autonomy should they speak out due to the Church's current policy on mandatory reporting in England and Wales. This is a key example of how, when we discuss accountability for survivors, the solution can raise more questions. For many survivors who have spoken out, mandatory reporting is a non-negotiable, given the previous failures to report to the statutory authorities. But for others that want to be in charge of who they tell and when they tell them, the message of immediately reporting to the statutory agency can actually silence them. We cannot be accountable to survivors if they do not feel able to come forward. This is not an issue that I will be able to address here in this presentation, but I think is one worthy of consideration in the workshops. So, even on this, possibly the most non-controversial issue of easy reporting, there's still much for the Church to do. However, survivors have generously provided simple, effective solutions to be adopted. Use clear, unambiguous language. Prominently display it everywhere. Say what you mean. Offer options. Can someone speak to someone within the religious organisation or a survivors group? How would someone know this? How would someone know that this is not a binary choice? That they can speak with both organisations? That they can start with one and move to another? That there is a shared mission, irrespective of the person or organisation that they choose to initially reach out to simply provide the best support, whatever that means for them. Having a carefully considered safeguarding statement is what survivors have told us has often been a critical factor for them in deciding whether to trust the organisation to report or not. So engage with survivors and survivors' organisations in the development of a strong safeguarding statement. Review it often. Check it. Is it still fit for purpose? Does it say everything that you want it to say? And most importantly, will it encourage a survivor to come forward and speak to your organisation? Having said that this is around accountability is around human contact, there is some space for the use of technology. Survivors groups have reported great success with the use of self-referral apps or other anonymous means of reporting for those who do not yet feel comfortable talking in person. This is particularly key in our preventative, proactive work with children, as this is their world. Digital communication is their norm. This has been used incredibly successfully across survivors' organisations, allowing an individual to build confidence in the organisation. In the Diocese of Salford, prior to using a survivors' organisational self-referral app, there would be an annual count of around 30 referrals into the diocese. On the first year of using this app, the survivors' organisation was working with 300. Thankfully, I have had many positive experiences working with religious organisations where survivors have felt that they were the priority for the individual religious leader in the moment, in the actual meeting. And I will talk about some of the factors that have allowed this to be the case in just a minute. But I felt it was opportune to share a recent experience only last month with the permission of the survivor, where even in the most literal sense, the survivor had not been met. She had requested a meeting, and because of the distance, it was agreed that the meeting would be online. This was not problematic at all for the survivor. Despite the fact that I was no longer officially part of the case, because I had worked with the survivor for many years. She had asked me to attend because she was nervous. I agreed to attend, but only to be there as a support facilitator. This was an adult with agency and autonomy. She was intelligent and articulate and could speak for herself. She asked me to be there to listen, to provide emotional support and take notes, which I was glad to do. We had agreed an agenda with the religious leader prior to the meeting, and so I was hopeful that although this may be a challenging encounter, it would be a healing one for all. I could not sadly have been more wrong. The leader had brought along his canon lawyer. That in itself was not problematic. However, instead of each of them sitting at their own screen, they decided to share one screen sat behind a desk. What this meant for the survivor was that she literally could not see their faces. She could not see the response to her account of abuse, and as such, she felt that she had not been seen. How damaging was this for rapport building and developing a safe space that Tina talked about earlier? They also chose a platform for which we had a clock continuously counting down from the 40 minutes. 40 minutes to share your experience of abuse and the harm that's been caused. It spoke of a lack of dignity and respect for the person in front of them. They also chose, after each part of the account being shared with them, to scooch off and have a quiet conflab in whispered tones, and came back then with their response. I want to believe that their behaviour was motivated by a deep desire to get things right, to provide the right answers. But even if this was the case, their behaviour prioritised the process and their needs over the person in front of them. I raise this only to illustrate that sometimes on the most basic of levels, we can still fail to meet the person and make them our priority. Such examples of real-life experiences hopefully serve to act as a reminder that we need to be scrupulously prepared for our engagement with survivors, never be complacent, provide the time, commit, and be present. And finally, just a note from one professional to another. If you are there to support a survivor online, please ensure that you know how to create a safe breakout when things are going wrong. So now on to some more general explorations of survivors' experiences. I have heard of religious leaders that have refused to meet with survivors, and others who have thought that it was appropriate, following the recommendation from the Independent Inquiry into Childhood Sexual Abuse, to meet all of the victims in his diocese, none of whom he had met before, on a 20-minute carousel, because this would get the job done. I know that I don't need to explain to any of you that both of these responses are totally inadequate, but sadly for some survivors, these have been their lived experiences of our church. I have worked with survivors from other dioceses who have been told that their abuse did not happen, or that it was their fault because they were 15 years old and had consented to the relationship. For many survivors that have been offered counselling, this has been for a maximum number of 6 or 8 sessions, either because of financial reasons or because of the belief that talking therapy only makes things worse for abuse survivors. From my work with survivors, they have said that what they wanted was a choice of pastoral support. For some of them, they'd already done the hard work of therapy. For others, therapy was not for them. So to then have a response of nothing was totally inadequate. From my work with survivors, the thing that most disappointed them, though, was when a religious leader felt unable to meet them unaccompanied, as this then restricted what they felt they could say and what the religious leader could say. For some survivors, having a safeguarding person present was reassuring, For others, it hindered their healing process. This has been echoed by religious leaders, with some advising that they don't feel they're able to be authentic or present because they're nervous or self-conscious that they might get things wrong in front of the safeguarding person. Both parties have reported that the experience can be process-driven rather than person-driven, hindering the sense of connectedness, which is so important if the relationship is to be helpful. And also, both parties have stated that this hindrance is only heightened when the person surviving them is from a legal background. Even basic things like the choice of venue is important if we are to take into account survivors' experience. What we believe to be a neutral church space can have complicating factors, religious iconography or symbolism, all of which can be too much for a survivor. We need to consider the most basic aspects of all of our encounters. The window of tolerance for all of us when under pressure or stress can understandably become very narrow, and so we can perceive otherwise ordinary things as a threat. I once arrived to meet a survivor at their agreed place wearing a white blouse that popped out above a black pinafore. Usual work attire for me, but for that survivor, he perceived me to be a nun and became immediately distressed. I had not worn that outfit intentionally, but that was his belief once he discovered that I was not a nun. He thought that I had worn it to distract him and to cause him greater harm and concern. So every single interaction needs consideration, and always when we get things wrong, a sincere and heartfelt apology. The strongest and repeating message I have heard when we do not take proper account of a survivor's experience is that they feel invisible, not seen, not heard, irrelevant. Therefore, it is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that we are ever present, people-centred, grounded, not distracted, and able to meet a survivor ready to share their experiences. Having worked with two amazing local survivors' organisations, I will share what I have learned and how all of us are able to do this well. For each interaction, be it in person, online, by phone or on email, the principles of a facilitated listening meeting work. They are very simple but very effective. The first practice requirement is to ensure that counsellor is available to both the survivor and for you. Whilst it is possible for a counsellor to be present for meetings, I recognise that it's not always possible for them to be available on the phone or over email. However, if you can communicate this early on during the exchange to a survivor, that they will have access to an experienced counsellor, I hope you will find, like I did, that the tone of the dialogue changes significantly. It allows for a more honest exchange, and it also allows us to be boundaried in our role. We don't have to try to be all things to the survivor. We don't need to dabble in counselling whilst trying to do our job. It also means that we can spend time being with the survivor, hearing them, sitting with them, and at times in the uncomfortableness of the experience, but not running away from it or protecting ourselves, because we know that that support is there for us too. Survivors have said that knowing that a counsellor was available to them, either during the exchange or immediately afterwards, meant that they felt they were able to be more open about their experiences. Establishing agreed agendas is a really helpful tool for us as practitioners, as it sets clear expectations, which should then hopefully result in a positive outcome for the survivor, because we have already taken off the table things that we cannot offer. And whilst this may sound in some ways limiting, in my experience, survivors have appreciated the honesty and have concentrated then on the engagement with the person in front of them. I cannot overemphasize the importance of the sense of connectedness for survivors, to be seen, heard, validated, valued and respected, even when they are dysregulated. I have heard from colleagues where they have ended a meeting because a survivor has shouted or been abusive. Whilst I'm not advocating for someone to remain in a dangerous or threatening environment, we need to be able to hold a space where survivors can be critical of the church, its leaders, and ourselves. We can not only work with those who want to work with us. This is where partnership arrangements with survivors' organisations assist in providing a truly accountable experience for survivors. It is part of our role to work with those who disappeared from the church. Our interactions with these individuals is the genuine measure of how truly accountable we are to survivors. It is vital also that we are informed about the individual and about the process and what we can and cannot commit to. It is all too tempting to overpromise in situations which we may find challenging in order to move things on, but overall this damages trust in the relationship and in the organisation. We must be boundaries, and we must never leave a meeting with a survivor without a clear action plan. They need to know what they can expect of us and when. Trust the process. This is a phrase that maybe many of you have heard. It's certainly one that I have used repeatedly when meeting with survivors. It was easy for me to say this. I knew the process well, and despite its flaws and failures, I had generally navigated it successfully over the years. Then came the real challenge. Survivors would say, okay, to trust the process, I need to understand the process. Explain the process. My response was always the same. My heart would sink, because although with the assistance of an excellent canon lawyer and safeguarding committee, I understood what needed to happen, but explaining it was much trickier. To begin with, which process? The criminal one, the civil one, the canonical one? The church procedures where I worked were sometimes over 40 pages long, in a mixture of secular and church language. How then do you explain a 40-page document in a 1-hour meeting? What parts of the process should I choose to highlight? What should I leave out? Should I just give them the whole document? Following the National Inquiry's recommendations to simplify the procedures so that the process could be better understood, the current policy is now 3 pages long. That said, there is still a 32-page practice guidance to go with it. Survivors have reported mixed views on the separation of the policy and the practice guidance, with some advising that it is positive, as they can now follow the church's intention without needing to be bogged down in all of the detail, whilst others have commented that it is literally the church shuffling papers. Others have questioned why the church has moved to practice guidance and believe that it is so that dioceses and religious orders can choose not to comply with it. In my experience, there is still much distrust of the church for those survivors engaged in the process, and I believe part of this is because we have not found a clear way of communicating this to them. One overwhelmingly positive response, however, has been the revision of the language used, which is far more familiar to them for all of those that are outside of the church's formal structures. Survivors have repeatedly told us there is a lack of transparency in the church process and that they fail to recognise the individual needs, whether pastoral, emotional or financial, to the survivor. Even though the church has the norms and the laws to safeguard individuals from abuse, there remains a postcode lottery approach to how different religious organisations apply them, leaving survivors feeling confused and quite rightly dissatisfied. Furthermore, survivors have reported that they are provided with little or no information during the process, which leads them to distrust the organisation and further unnecessary anxiety. Within the diocese, with the support of survivors' organisations, we were able to appoint independent sexual violence advisors to assist survivors, to ask questions and to enable them to sensitively share the information back to the survivor so that the further harm was minimised by the sharing of the information. However, once again, the solution can provide more questions and difficulties. For example, when working with one survivor, who at the time was an inpatient in a psychiatric unit, he wanted to know if he had been the only survivor of abuse of an individual priest. It was not known if the information known to the diocese would cause him further harm. He had repeatedly stated that he believed that he and the priest had a special bond, a special relationship, and at times that this had been a loving relationship. How damaging would it be, therefore, for him to realise that he was one of 30 boys that had been abused by that priest, and that his name had not even registered with the priest when we spoke to him. Through the support of the independent sexual violence advisor and with the consent of the psychiatrist, it was agreed that this information should be shared with the survivor. This was as a result of him being stuck and not being able to move on with his psychological work. Despite this having been done sensitively by members of the psychiatric team, the man was devastated and his mental health was significantly impaired in the short term. All of us were left wondering if we had done the right thing. The psychiatric team believed that we had, because for them, their work was then to look at the moving forward work. For me, however, I struggled with this. I could not sit with this. By trying to respect his wishes and feelings, by providing the information about the relationship with that priest, he was further damaged and he felt that the church had betrayed him again. He then wanted to know the names of the other boys that had been abused, and I'm sure you'll all understand why this was not possible for us. For him, that felt like we were hiding information and another betrayal, another reason to not trust us. So all of these issues are tricky, and I hope that during your workshops you'll be able to consider some of the implications of these issues. Another issue raised by survivors is the treatment that they have received when asking questions about the process, with survivors being labelled as needy when asking for information. The lack of transparency can run through the whole case, but it is particularly problematic when it involves the commissioning of a psychological assessment for a priest, raising many questions. Whose information is this? The accused, the survivors, the religious orders, the diocese, the assessors? In one case I worked with, these issues were taken through a civil trial to establish who had the right to what information, providing further delays and even more distress for those involved, and setting the religious order against the survivor, who believed that she had the right to know what had been said about her. Eventually, it was agreed by the court that on the conclusion of the criminal trial, that the survivor could be provided with a summary document prepared by the assessor with any information related to them. This was further highlighted during the independent inquiry into childhood sexual abuse, where one survivor had been advised by the diocese that they would be entitled to a summary document. However, that diocese changed its mind upon the advice of solicitors. This was devastating for the survivor, as they did not know if their testimony had been deemed to be credible. It had. So why could she not be provided with the solace that this information would bring her? It's important that we all think about how we can do these difficult situations better in our organisations. Another common theme is the reluctance or failure to communicate with survivors, leaving them having to push for information, which is time-consuming, emotionally draining, and requires persistence and determination on behalf of the survivor. Survivors have told us that ineffective communication and the lack of transparency makes them feel like a nuisance at best and that they are being manipulated when asking for information. When survivors come forward, a clear communication plan should be established at the earliest opportunity. This requires discipline, time, and strong boundaries on the part of the safeguarding professional. As such, a plan is only effective if it is kept to. Furthermore, survivors advise that they find the process too administratively focused rather than people-focused, and that they believe that the church wants to tick boxes to be seen to do things right, rather than simply doing the right thing. This can be particularly true when organisations feel they are being scrutinised, developing more policies, procedures and paperwork rather than listening to and being available to survivors. Survivors report experience obfuscation and fudging rather than a lack of clarity from those administering the process. As a practitioner undertaking independent investigations for religious orders, I have also experienced this, with church personnel only providing the information that was requested rather than all of the relevant information. A more lasting and meaning benefit for you is to secure your organisation's commitment to safeguarding. What this means is that you are able to share your values and commitment to survivors throughout your organisation, and that it is embedded throughout the organisation and with the involvement and engagement of all. Resources, whether it be financial or personnel, can then also be allocated to effectively support survivors. Developing a clear, easy-to-follow, time-sensitive complaints policy is another means of practically demonstrating accountability to and for survivors. If we are confident that our commitment to survivors is genuine, then we should be open to learning lessons when we make mistakes or get things wrong. We should not be afraid of hearing where we can improve either our own individual practice or systemic organisational failures. We should assume positive intent on behalf of the individual generous enough to take time out of their busy lives, jobs, from families and friends, interests and hobbies. And so we should afford them the respect and gratitude they deserve when they help us to improve our organisations for the benefit of others. Another concrete way of demonstrating our commitment to survivors is to ensure that those who have harmed are not free to simply disappear to take up ministry in another diocese or religious order. Survivors are most scathing where organisations have failed to close the loop and allow an abuser to continue to have access to children in another context. The Church has for many years demonstrated its wider commitment to society and community by developing effective safeguarding plans that allow a priest or a member of their community to remain within the diocese or the religious order. This, however, whilst effective, receives much criticism from survivors who see the Church as taking more care of the accused or abuser than of survivors. How can we effectively balance these often competing demands? My suggestion would be to ensure that the survivor feels that they are genuinely the priority, that they are engaged in meaningful dialogue with our organisations, and that they trust us to do what's right and take whatever action necessary to prevent further harm to others, including at times keeping abusers within our communities. Not in active ministry, but as a means of paying back to the survivor and society by not allowing them to go unnoticed where they may be able to be harm again. The Church in England and Wales for many years has held a database that allows safeguarding officers to identify priests who may pose a risk of harm to others, and are considering publishing the names of priests who have been convicted or laicized as a result of abusing a child or adult at risk of harm. More work needs to be done, however, to be truly accountable by ensuring that the robust application of procedures are in place during an investigation, so that a priest who is not in good standing is not able to be in active ministry elsewhere. The norms are there to be utilised, but there needs to be a robust oversight from religious leaders to ensure that all relevant checks are in place to restrict the ministry of someone under investigation. The use of safeguarding advisory panels or safeguarding committees made up of lay professionals to oversee the ongoing casework is an effective means of demonstrating our accountability to survivors and to ensure a more open, transparent and effective response for survivors. In my experience, these professionals not only bring excellent knowledge of the criminal and civil processes, but they also provide effective challenge. However, for some organisations, they have criticised the Church's approach to having an out-there safeguarding panel and have requested instead that the diocese and the religious orders bring that work in-house as a subcommittee of their trustees. There are benefits and costs to both, I would say, as the merit of bringing a safeguarding panel, the safeguarding function of a diocese to the trustees demonstrates that the organisation is serious about their commitment and owning its decisions. However, the lack of transparency, oversight and challenge is yet to be seen in terms of the effect for survivors. Another area of contention is the use of survivors to assist organisations to improve their safeguarding response to survivors. Some dioceses and religious orders have been criticised for compromising the safety and well-being of a small number of survivors as evidence that they are engaging with survivors. In my professional opinion, survivors working with religious organisations should only do so where there is an absolute commitment to co-production and co-design to develop a more joined-up service and a safe space for survivors. This involves a doing with in an equal and reciprocal partnership rather than the more tokenistic and common but damaging doing for or to survivors approach. So, what does that look like? An independent expert advisory panel or a lived experience panel. We accept that this is the best blueprint for accountability to survivors, but again, it does not come without its own tensions and questions. Firstly, we need to recognise the emotional cost of taking part in this work, and as such, it requires a commitment to the ongoing safeguarding of the group's welfare. Therefore, we need to ask ourselves, are we able to do this properly? Are we able to do this well? Will this produce good outcomes for survivors and not just for our organisations? Will it be worth the cost to the individuals involved? There is also a running tension for survivors about how close is too close to the institution responsible for so much abuse and re-abuse. In my experience, this has required independent facilitators to be the guardians of these safe spaces. I have seen this work best when survivors' organisations and religious organisations are able to work together. The Healing Through Community initiative, in partnership with Survivors Manchester, Greater Manchester Rape Crisis and the Diocese of Salford, saw, as I previously said, approximately 300 survivors in its first year, as opposed to the annual figure of around 30 survivors that the diocese had previously worked with. However, it requires much work, and it requires us moving from a reactive, piecemeal approach to survivor engagement. It means that we need to effectively communicate with survivors, and it means that we need to move from that heavy reliance on a small number of survivors to speak for the many, and not have an over-reliance on the generosity of that small number of survivors. But it also provides an opportunity, because it means building on a proven delivery ability of those survivor organisations, which means, in my experience, that survivors are more likely to work with us and trust us. The non-negotiables for survivors are that the work is inclusive, independent, empowered, supported, resourced, strategic, and professionally systematic, cyclical, and planned. And as always, having said, I did not think I would have much to talk to you about. I've just been reminded from Tina that I have run over time, so I will quickly go through the final slide, which is around effective follow-up for survivors. The common theme here is that survivors felt that they were perceived by the organisation, received by the organisation in a grudging and unsympathetic manner. And that whilst the most commonly proffered solution was to professionalise the leadership, governance, management and delivery of safeguarding, this has not, in their opinion, equated to a better response from the church. Many survivors reported the harm that the change in leadership can cause when provincials have to move on, having to build relationships and then only to find out that they have to rebuild new relationships, which at best makes them feel frustrated and at worst makes them feel unimportant and devalued. They have also advised of experiencing a reluctance, even now, after all of these inquiries, research and revisions to our church structures and processes, to acknowledge responsibility for the harm caused. As spoken about previously, the change of commitment partway through the process is possibly the most damaging to individuals involved in the case. The other area of huge contention that I'm sure you're all aware of is the non-apology apology. All survivors that I have spoken with have said that was more damaging than no apology at all. And the final tension is this rush to fix and move on, with survivors describing them having been experienced as a problem rather than an individual with a legitimate concern to raise or a solution to provide. This dehumanising of the person is painful for many and takes them back to their original abuse when their dignity was stripped. Many have described the church process as re-traumatising. So what is the solution? Putting prevention first, moving away from risk management that only focuses on legal, financial and reputational risk to the consideration of the health and well-being of people, communities and organisations, creating a culture of safeguarding, looking at our discernment, our training, looking at people, not policies and procedures, looking at having ethical leadership, and an assurance of non-recurrence of the abuse, and effective support plans in communication, in agreements and commitments, personal apologies and explanations, a truly pastoral response, and with the thorny issue of redress. And I will click, given that I've run out of time. So thank you all for your time.
Good evening. Mopelola Olusakin from University of Lagos, Nigeria. We just started Safeguarding Center, and I'm the pioneer director. We started last month. Okay. And I am learning. I'm a professor of counseling psychology, but I'm open to learn a lot more. Now the question, okay, just one question. You talked among so many other things that we have learned about apology without apologizing. We raised it in our group and we tried to explain it to ourselves, but hearing it from you would bring more light onto it. What do we mean by and authenticity of the professional? When we don't have the answer, what do we do? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for those questions. And thank you for raising the issue of the non-apology apology. So what many survivors have said is that they either get a generic apology that doesn't answer the issues that have raised, and on one occasion only addressed them in letter form by their Mrs. whoever, rather than their first name. And given that they were part of that community, they felt that to be incredibly dismissive and disrespectful. They wanted to be recognised in their terms, in their words. So that was the first thing. Stay away from the generic apologies. And the second thing is you can only truly apologise if you've sat in a room with someone. So many dioceses, many religious organisations have communications officers, and they will craft the apology. How can that be meaningful? How can that say to somebody that we've heard you and we're going to change things? So you need to sit in the room, hear somebody's account, and then write a deeply, deeply, deeply personal apology that is addressed to only that individual. Because one of the things that survivors groups do is they share your letters of apology. They know what you do with them. They know the ones that have just been crafted. So it's really about being specific and being genuine and authentic in your apology. And then the second thing around the authenticity of the professional is if we do not know the answer, the only response then is to be honest and say, we do not know the answer. We have heard you, we've listened, but we will go away and find that answer. And what you must do is put a time limit on that, because we're all really busy. None of us are sitting here with time on our hands, so it's easy for cases to drift. So if you don't know the answer at that particular time, my advice would be you will find it and go back within a very short time period, because it's disrespectful to expect a survivor to come forward again and ask us for that piece of information. Does that answer the question?
I was struck by the point you made with regard to the importance of a space that can hold where a survivor is critical of us and the church. I wonder if you could elaborate on the us, because I think that's really important.
Okay, so this is my experience. I have been in spaces, as you could probably tell from my very personal presentation, where survivors have been incredibly critical, not just of the church. That's an easy one in some respects. That's easier because it's out there. But when they've been critical of the bishop, or when they've been critical of me as a professional. And I think the only way that we can do this with any authenticity for ourselves and maintain our own professional self-esteem is to make sure that there is a support facilitator there to hear those questions. So it's really easy for us to get defensive. It's really easy of us to have egos or to think, I'm doing my best. So for me, I would always say, go find a good local survivors organisation and have a professional support facilitator that allows the survivor to come and say what they want to say and allows you to respond without ego. And I would always say that prepared agenda will also help, because you're going into a room knowing what the issues are for that survivor. Personally, I've never had any problem saying I've got things wrong and I'm sorry. But that's only one part. The next part and the important part is, what am I going to do to make amends for that? And I think that's a really important lesson for us all. So it is about accountability being active.
Thank you. I was interested, you said about the digital communication, that this is the world of our children. So I wanted to ask, how we can use that tool if for church the anonymous information is not enough. So just on an open question, how we can use this tool, a digital world. Thank you.
So I think this may be answered better in a speech later in the week, because I think we've got someone talking specifically about this issue. But in my experience, there are two things around digital platforms for us. There is that anonymous level that allows someone to just test out what our responses are. So they can report things in and we can report back through the anonymous self-referral app so that they know what the answers are, and they can either decide that they're satisfied with those answers and they're going to come forward and speak to us. And I know that's a bit problematic for lots of people because they think we need to know the name of someone. We're in a rush to find, we go back to that risk assessment and that risk management. But if you think of the alternative, that is that person's never going to come forward. So at least hopefully by that initial anonymous stage, if we can get the communication right and build that relationship, then we will encourage someone to come forward. So that's the first part. And sorry, can you repeat the second part of your question?
Just how we can use that tool.
So the thing that I would say is you can only use tools with two stages. So if you report something to this level, then it remains anonymous. The minute that you name somebody, then it can no longer remain anonymous because we've then got to go on and do something. So that's where digital platforms can work, but also where there's a barrier, because again, for survivors, that sense of control is really, really important. So I would only want that first level to be where we would use a digital platform. At the point where we were taking action, I would want that to be a human interaction where there was a dialogue between the professional and the survivor. Sorry.
Hi, Carlos from Mexico. So in the Spanish group was discussed the fact that in your presentation, the topic about reparation wasn't widely addressed. So we were wondering if reparation is part of the accountability process and what it would be composed of. Thanks.
Sorry, that was because I ran out of time. So reparation and redress for me, it always surprises me when there's such a visceral response to the rights as a survivor for reparation or redress. It's their absolute right. It's enshrined in legislation. I don't understand why it's such a big issue for us as a church. So it complicates things, by fact that we then have solicitors involved, but there almost needs to be a wall between the solicitors and the insurers will deal with the reparation and the redress, and we as a church will deal with that pastoral response to to the survivor. And I have worked now in the last 2 years with many, many organisations, religious organisations, that have chosen to ignore the advice of their insurer and actually say, this is the right thing to do. We need to make some reparation for this survivor. For lots of survivors, it's not that big an issue, but for some survivors it is. And I think it's about having that moral courage to say, this is our organisation, this is our church. The solicitors and the insurers are there to advise, but actually if we think this is what we should do, then that's what you do. And it's really interesting because solicitors like working with us. So if you then go back and say, no, that's not what I want to do, even though you have strongly advocated for it, they will still work with you to draw up a pastoral payment that fits your charity law guidance. So lots of you are from different parts of the world, and forgive me, I don't know how things work here, but there is a financial responsibility on religious orders in the UK. But the solicitors are able to word that in such a way that the Charity Commission can see that reparation from that order is there for the good of the beneficiaries. So there are ways around it. You've got to be creative and you've got to be brave. And I think that's probably one of the things that you need to take away from today.
Thank you so much.
Good evening. Geno Tikili from the Philippines. Accountability, not just to the victims, but also to the perpetrators. This insight opened my mind. What does it mean? And as a village or as a community of believers, have we been unjust, not just to the victims, but also to the perpetrators?
Sorry, can you just clarify that question?
Okay. The insight that accountability, not just to the victims, but also to the abusers or the perpetrators. What does it mean? And as a village or as a community of believers, have we been unjust, not just to the victims, but also to the perpetrators? Have we been unjust to the perpetrators?
So I'm not sure is the honest answer. What I would say is that I think as a church we've become, we focused on risk assessment and risk management and dealing with that as the priority. And for lots of survivors, that's what they want. They want that person to no longer be able to harm other people. But I think we've got a bigger journey to do, which is how do we work with survivors and perpetrators to allow survivors to be able to perpetrators to acknowledge the harm that they've caused and make amends. And often, in my experience, we deal with the two of them completely separately. And that's because we haven't gone back to the survivor to ask them, what's your experience? What do you want? And what we have to remember is for some survivors, they are family members or friends of family. They're not people that are out there. So I'm not sure if we've been unjust, but I think there's a lot more work that we need to do to go back to survivors and survivors groups to say, how do we make this work? How do we support the perpetrator to make amends? Because very often when someone is convicted, they are not contacted by their diocese or their religious order. It's an embarrassment and they want to cut them off. Well, the main thing there is we can't learn, and we need to speak to them to be able to learn from their experience, but also to give the opportunity for the survivor to hear from them. So I have been part of a number of facilitated listening meetings where, with extreme care and attention, survivors have been in a room with their perpetrator that has been professionally facilitated, and that has brought some healing. But I think it's a piece of work that most of us, even me, having done 13 years, are scared of, and we need support to do that properly, I would say.
Hi, Dawn. I'm Tim Moore from the Institute of Child Protection Studies at the Australian Catholic University. So one of the things we hear from survivors of clerical abuse is that, particularly where the church has failed to adequately respond, is that the abuse is traumatic, but also their sense of identity, their relationship with their God, with their faith community is significantly corroded. Have you seen ways in which church communities have been able to respond and create that healing, particularly for those who are wanting to remain connected to the church, but also those that have obviously been devastated as a result of that abuse and the church's response?
Yeah. So I'm aware in Salford Diocese, and sorry, this is really local, but with a survivors group, they have worked with a group of survivors and a group of priests and a group of priests who are survivors to look at doing a group session once a week, and that currently happens, whereby survivors who want to reconnect to faith, so not necessarily their Catholic faith, they have faith leaders from many faiths, and there are people there, survivors who have no faith but are interested in the concept of faith and the healing power of faith. So there is a very successful project there that is working around scripture and looking at how scripture can help them. And I would say it's a piece of work that we need to do much, much more of, because the most damaging experience for me, having witnessed survivors, is they have been brought up as a Catholic, their faith has been integral to who they are, and they lose a loved one, or a member of their family is very ill, and they come and say, I can't pray. That is another loss for them, and it's really important that we do find creative and sensitive ways to do that piece of work. The only point I would add to that is to get to that point where that was a safe space took 18 months. 18 months of weekly meetings before they were ever able to do it. But I think it's probably one of the most valuable pieces of work that's happening in the church at the moment.
Hi, Lian Sala from the Philippines. I have a 2-point. One is a response to Geno. On the question actually of are we being unjust to the accused? I spoke with a priest back home in the Philippines who's responsible for forming seminarians. And he gave a story of a fellow priest of his whom he said when his father died, nobody, from the diocese showed any support. And a few months later, his brother died, still nobody. Then he fell, in chastity. That's when everybody showed up, like the police. So I think it's like one example of preventive measures maybe, which also translate to justice. Like a form of justice is to help prevent people from falling, which is to accompany them well. And then I'd just like to bring up a concern from one of my group members about a line earlier. I think it was about moving away from legal processes. She might want to expound on it. Can someone bring the mic to Attorney Lisa Horda, please?
While the mic's being taken there, just because I'm conscious of time, I'll answer your first question. So yes, I think there's much work still to be done for us around discernment for priesthood, and certainly for pastoral support for the clergy. It's a message I hear repeatedly. I think probably most people here would say they recognise that story. I think my only caveat would be to say, yes, there should be support. Yes, we need to work with people while they are discerning, but not to confuse that with their support is separate, abuse is abuse, and it's quite right that the police were called in terms of that. So if I've misunderstood you, that's fine.
Okay, I was listening to you and you said something like to help the victim is also to move away from the legal process. So that's what stuck in my mind, because for us as a prosecutor, sending a strong signal, conviction would send a strong signal to the perpetrator. So it's a deterrence for the commission of a crime. Because back in the Philippines, a sexual abuse is a public crime. It's no longer a personal crime. So the state is very interested. The state intervenes so that the witness here, the victim is reduced to a mere witness. So we take over already. So that is very important for us, thinking about the 4-piece approach: prevention, prosecution, participation, protection.
Yeah, and I totally agree. So that's a point of clarity for me. I didn't mean in terms of state legal intervention. That absolutely is right. But what survivors are saying is our canonical process is too legalistic and not pastoral enough. So I don't think it's a binary choice. We need to have both, but it's about how do we separate those two things out, and who should follow through on that legal process, and how and who then provides that pastoral support. So I think it's about both. And I think it goes back to the point that someone said earlier about survivors not having to repeat their statement. So it's about, once we've got the information, we shouldn't then bring survivors back into other processes to ask them to repeat their experience, because that's re-traumatizing. So thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
Hi, Tim O'Malley from Minnesota in the United States. along the lines of responding to the comment about accountability for both perpetrators and victim survivors and the alternative to legal processes. I know some other countries are doing it, but the United States is starting to take off this restorative justice concept of having meetings outside of the pure legal processes and other items. Susan Mulheron's here with me, and she and I have both participated in a number of those, and they can be extremely beneficial if both the abuser and the abused are willing, openly willing to do it, if they're well prepared. You don't have some amateur doing this, that they know what they're doing. Then I think it can be really beneficial in terms of healing for both sides to have some accountability and some option to move forward in a healthier way.
I totally agree. And the only point I would add to that is you have to be confident that you know the perpetrator and the work has been done, because there has been experiences where survivors have gone into a room expecting that healing process, and actually the perpetrator has took the control back. That has then been damaging. So it's about knowing the people, I would say.
My name is Alex from Nigeria. I just graduated from the diploma course here with all the knowledge, skills, and the competencies. But I am living in an environment whereby people, including clergy, do not believe that sexual abuse takes place, especially by the clergy. So now I'm going back to that kind of environment, full of energy and the zeal to work. So what do you suggest I should do in this kind of context? Thank you.
You're going to be an innovator. I suggest you network really well and find your friends and colleagues and get professional support. It is really, really tricky, and there isn't any easy answer. But what I would say is every one of us well, not every one of us, but every country was in that position possibly at some point. So it's about being brave, having the courage to take things forward, maintain the message and the enthusiasm and the skills, because you could be opening doors, and if you open door for just one person, then that's an invaluable experience. But we're all on different journeys in terms of our jurisdiction and where their understanding is in terms of sexual abuse. So go back, look at the research, don't lose hope, and you know, use your skills wisely and widely, I would say.
Thank you. My name is Bala. I'm from Nigeria, a licentiate student here. In accountability to the victim, does restorative justice play any role?
Yes, I think it's really important. As we've heard, it works really well, and the process of restorative justice is that experience of the facilitated listening meeting that I was talking about in the presentation. Again, though, it takes time, and it takes time for it to work well and for it to be a secure and safe place. Then you need to be able to commit to it. And as we've talked about, you know, throughout the day, there are resource needs there. So it's not something you can dabble in. It's not something you can give a go. You have to secure a commitment from your organisation that that's the approach that you're going to take, and then finance it, train people, provide the right people to do the work, and provide the support for them. So it's not a quick fix, but I think it is the way for us to move forward.
Thank you very much. I believe we can't cover everything today. Today being the beginning of the conference. I know as we move on tomorrow and in the other days to come, we're going to delve into the other area of accountability, and the issue of safeguarding. And in our group, we also suggested that there might be short role playing of like 10 minutes, whereby certain people will be the ones that will be officers, and someone would have a similitude of certain aspect, and then all of us would watch, and then we will also make contributions regarding such role play. It could be done in our different groups and see what it is that, and because when people see, they tend to remember more. So as we move on, the other areas, we will delve into them as the days continue to unfold. We want to thank you for that insightful presentation that you did this morning, and we wish you more and more of it, even as we continue in this delicate job of safeguarding. Thank you.
Thank you.
Some of the students, the graduates in the room are smiling at me at the moment because it's bringing back memories of, particularly when I do the week on responding to victims, we do some role playing. And I think they're sitting there thinking, please, Tina, no more. It can be effective. I don't think this is necessarily the forum for this time.
I don't think that's the forum, but I know Barry and Brendan use a really useful exercise in their training, so you might want to talk to them. And they ask people to stand in the shoes of the survivor, in the shoes of the priest, in the shoes of the bishop, and then rotate that round just to get a sense of how that feels. So Barry and Brendan, if you can put your hands up, and so go and speak to those guys is what I would say. Sorry. So if there's no questions, further questions coming this way, I'd just like to ask if anyone else has used restorative justice and what their experience has been.
We are in Spain. And in the processes we do for repairing, because what we do is repairing, all the process we do, we think that we are doing restorative justice. Because at the end, maybe the victim is not going to encounter the aggressor, but maybe the institution. And maybe this may take place or not. But all the processes for us is under the principles of restorative justice. This is how do we do the work.
I am Sister Marivic Santana from the Philippines. We are working for the healing and recovery of sexually abused and trafficked girls, not necessarily of the clergy. So our dilemma is when a child comes back from the court case, usually they are withdrawn and are really traumatized. Like one child was saying, when I saw my father at the witness stand or at the court, she broke down. And the judge said, better take out the child and we will reset the... So this is happening to many of our girls. And they are demonstrating very strange behavior before and after the court case. And one of the girls was saying, can we just go on healing by forgiving my father, or should I really put him behind bars and suffer the consequence? One of the fathers of our child died in the prison. And she said, while she stayed with us, she's working now, but she said the memory of not having a closure with the father is very strong, because even the mother would not like her to see the father because of the abuse that was done. So sometimes this is a dilemma. It's not always the answer to file a case. But in our center, our decision is we respect what the child decides. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take the final question from Brendan, and then we're going to have a well-deserved break before the reception at 7:30. Thank you.
Thank you. It's not a question, it's a response to Dawn's comment about restorative justice. I profoundly believe in restorative justice as a process, but I've not been involved myself, but I know of one occasion where unintentionally it was not well done, and I think it teaches an important lesson. What happened was Provincial brought together the brother who abused and a young man who was abused, who was quite confident and able and articulate, but it wasn't prepared, and the brother minimized and denied what happened. The young man did not go away worse because he was quite a strong individual, but the lesson I learned from people I've spoken to is simply bringing them together with goodwill is not restorative justice. There are skilled people with training who prepare both sides so that when the two people come together, there are no surprises. And each person knows what they will say and what they need and what they're going to offer. And I think that's the key thing I'd like to pass on to you from an unintentional, unfortunate experience. If you do this, and I support it, make sure it's done well.
Thank you very much. Can I conclude by thanking Dawn for keeping going this afternoon, apart from anything else, for a very rich presentation.